Hey, it's NPR's Book of the Day. I'm Andrew Limbong. All right, sometimes you open a book because you want to be taken somewhere, anywhere besides your hot and humid home office where the free AC you got from your neighbor can barely bring the room down to 80 degrees. In a bit, we'll hear about a thriller set in the Adirondack Mountains in 1975. But first, Courtney Sullivan's new novel, The Cliffs, takes place in a mansion along a shoreline. And it's about an archivist that does some digging into the house and finds all these stories of women throughout the years connected to the mansion and the land it's on. It's a bit overplayed to say that the setting is the main character of a story, but in this interview with NPR's Mary Louise Kelly, the two of them talk about how much the time and place of a woman's birth determines her future. That's ahead.
Support for NPR and the following message come from IXL Online. Is your child asking questions on their homework you don't feel equipped to answer? IXL Learning uses advanced algorithms to give the right help to each kid, no matter the age or personality. One subscription gets you everything. One site for all the kids in your home, pre-K to 12th grade. Make an impact on your child's learning. Get IXL now. And NPR listeners can get an exclusive 20% off IXL membership when they sign up today at IXL.com/NPR.
The central character of Courtney Sullivan's new book, The Cliffs, is a house, an old Victorian house, which sits high above the sea in Maine. But like so much of Sullivan's work, the heart of this multi-generational story is women, and how often their stories are discarded or lost. If the central character of The Cliffs is a house, the protagonist is Harvard archivist Jane Flanagan. Jane returns to her hometown, site of the house in question, after an episode at a work party that has led to her being put on leave from her job and from her marriage. In an effort to fill her days, she begins documenting the history of the house for the new owner, and it is through telling these stories of the generations of women who lived there that Jane manages to begin to understand her own story. Courtney Sullivan joins me now. Welcome back to All Things Considered.
Thank you so much for having me.
This Victorian house in your book was inspired by a real house that you saw. Tell me about it.
It was. So probably 10 summers ago now, my husband and I were in southern Maine on vacation with our dear friends, Mike and Melissa, another couple, and we came upon this house, beautiful purple Victorian house on a cliff overlooking the ocean, fully furnished, down to pictures on the shelves and books on the tables, but clearly abandoned. And of course, for anyone who, once loved reading Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew or R.L. Stein, what could be more irresistible
Yeah, you want
than
to
this?
creep around the porch and figure out what the heck is going on in there.
Absolutely. And I did learn, there's two kinds of people. There are the people like me and Melissa who are like, an abandoned house, we must explore it. And then there are people like our husbands who are like, this is trespassing, actually. But we kept going back every summer. And we developed a relationship with this place to the point where, to some degree, we felt like it was ours. And then one summer we get there and it's gone. They have demolished it, and the new owners put this enormous sort of McMansion in its place. And I was so bereft. When I went home, I started writing about the house itself, right down to all the furnishings. The banister had caved in at some point, and there was a dollhouse in the corner, and little details like that. And then the actual physical details were fictionalized when I added in all the characters, the women who had lived there over many, many centuries.
Well, and you've kind of just mapped out the opening pages where your fictional character, Jane, has the same experience it sounds like you did. Spots this big purple house, abandoned yet fully furnished, on a cliff. Tell us how her relationship with that house grew.
Yes, so Jane, as an adult, she is an archivist, and she has her dream job, which is at the Schlesinger Library at Harvard. And the Schlesinger is this magical place that chronicles the lives of American women. And I discovered it when I was writing my novel, The Engagements. I went there and did research on one of my characters. And from then on, I thought, I really want to incorporate this place into a novel because it is so in sync with what I write about, which is this idea that the moment a woman is born will determine so much of who she's allowed to become. And Jane herself is really preoccupied with that. She's very intelligent. She comes from a family of women, very strong women and very strong-willed women. And she doesn't see the goodness in her family necessarily when she's in high school, when she's a teenager and first discovering this house. And the house is her hideaway from all of that. Yeah. And she really kind of just goes there to read and be alone. But coming back to her hometown 20 years later, having made her own colossal mistake, she sees it all sort of in a different light, including the house.
She goes all the way back to the 1600s. And among the things she unearths are the stories of all the women who have lived on this land and in this house. Do they have anything in common, all these generations of women going all the way up to Jane?
Oh my goodness, it's so funny because I feel like they really do. And I love that these women through time, for the most part, never meet one another. But I do envision them as being sort of in conversation with one another. For example, one of the women, Eliza, is raised as a Shaker at Sabbath Day Lake Shaker Village in Maine, which still exists. Eliza grows up there when it's much more robust. And there's also an indigenous woman, Conti, who is the first woman on that land in the book. And at some point, I just started looking around in my research. Did the indigenous Abenaki people in Maine ever cross paths with the Shakers? And they did. There was a famous winter market at Poland Springs, and these were two groups who came and sold baskets. And so I was able to kind of imagine what it would be like for Eliza, who is a Shaker, who other people are looking at and thinking, oh, they're sort of unusual, to see these Native American people and wonder what they might have in common.
I'm listening to you and I'm thinking it's so delightful, the stories of women interweaving. You're telling me about what Jane discovered as she went back through history, and you're doing the same thing as the author and creator of all this, going back through the history and figuring out the stories of women that were told and not told.
That's right. Before I was lucky enough to start writing fiction full-time, I was a researcher at the New York Times, and I loved that job. But I always imagined it would be so dreamy to just not have to do research anymore and just write fiction. And what I found immediately was I love doing research. It's my favorite part of the process, and sort of unearthing stories that may have been forgotten or may just not be known because there are so many stories. So to sort of pluck one out and tell it again, I feel like is so important.
I asked you what these generations of fictional women in your novel share in common. Do you share something in common with them, J. Courtney Sullivan?
Oh my goodness, so many things. Every one of the women in the book deals with things that most women deal with. So whether you're talking about an indigenous woman who is living her life when colonists first make contact with what becomes New England, or you're talking about Marilyn, who is an artist in the early 1960s and trying to sort of navigate what that looks like while also being a mother. Yes, they each live in a certain moment in time, but they all think a lot about motherhood and about love and romance and this sort of yearning, and they all have suffered great losses as well. And Jane has this in common with all of them. And she comes to learn, too, that there might be a reason why she's been drawn to this house in particular all her life. And I think that does tend to happen. I think as novelists, we're sort of called to write certain stories, and we may or may not know why. We may learn later why. But, these women, at every moment in time, we've dealt with, the specifics of our moment, but also just these sort of through lines that connect us through the centuries.
That's the author, J. Courtney Sullivan. Her gorgeous new novel is The Cliffs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Quince. Even on a budget, you still deserve nice things. Scoop up timeless high-quality goods for 50 to 80% less than similar brands with Quince. Go to quince.com/style for free shipping and 365-day returns.
This message comes from Progressive and its Name Your Price tool. Say how much you want to pay for car insurance, and they'll show coverage options within your budget. Visit Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Liz Moore's novel, The God of the Woods, takes place in the Adirondacks at a summer camp. It's 1975 and someone's gone missing. And in the Adirondacks, to this day, there's a tension between the people who live there year-round and the people who only visit on holiday. In this next interview, Liz tells NPR's Scott Simon about writing a crime novel with all its twists and red herrings that also explores class discrepancies.
Liz Moore's new novel, The God of the Woods, opens with a jolt. Not something that appears, but someone who is missing. It's dawn. In August 1975, in the cabin of a summer camp in the Adirondack Mountains, and we'll ask the author to pick up that moment.
The bed is empty. Louise, the counselor, 23, short-limbed, rasp-voiced, jolly, stands barefoot on the warm, rough planks of the cabin called Balsam and processes the absence of a body in the lower bunk by the door. Later on, the 10 seconds that pass between sight and inference will serve to her as evidence that time is a human construct, that it can slow or accelerate in the presence of emotion, of chemicals in the blood. The bed is empty. Louise turns slowly in a circle, naming the girls she can see. Melissa, Jennifer, Michelle, Amy, Caroline, Tracy, Kim. 8 campers, 9 beds. She counts and counts again. At last, when she can no longer defer it, she lets one name bob to the surface of her mind. Barbara.
The God of the Woods is the latest novel from Liz Moore, author of the bestseller Long Bright River. She joins us now from our member station WHYY in Philadelphia. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Scott. It's truly an honor to be here.
What a book. The missing camper is Barbara Van Laar. She's from a prominent family. And her older brother, Bear, disappeared 16 years before.
Yeah, that's right. So this story functions kind of as a dual mystery with an upstairs-downstairs theme at the heart of it, because the wealthy dynastic Van Laar family, who are fictional, own basically a mansion in the wilderness that they built in the late 1800s, and they also own a summer camp just down the hill from that house. So at the start of the novel, as you heard, their 13-year-old daughter goes missing from that camp. But she's not the first child of theirs to go missing, because earlier her older brother Bear also went missing from the same grounds. So there are lots of questions about whether this prominent family had something to do with the disappearance of both of their children. But there's also a lot of local people who come from the working class community nearby and who staff the camp, who also come under suspicion. And so everybody's sort of asking, did both children go missing for the same reason or by the same force, or was it two different things that caused them to go missing? And of course, where are they now?
And there's a looming presence of a guy called Slitter, isn't there?
There is, yeah. So Jacob Sluder, whose nickname is Slitter, it functions as a kind of like living ghost story for all the campers and the counselors in the 1970s. And he's fictional, but he's based on a real serial killer named Robert Garrow, who haunted the Adirondacks in the 1970s and who kind of haunted my imagination as a kid, although he died just before I was born.
Your father used to invoke him, right?
Yeah, my mother's family, my maternal ancestors come from the Adirondacks, and my mother was born and raised just south of there. My dad is not from there, but he loves to tell a ghost story, and he has no problem, or he had no problem when I was growing up, scaring his children and now his grandchildren. And so he delighted in telling us all about the scary things that happened in the Adirondacks for many generations, including Robert Garrow, this real-life serial killer who escaped incarceration and for whom there was a manhunt not once but twice. And that's who the Jacob Sluder character was based on.
As the story goes on, we learn that young Barbara did not have a happy home and family life, did she?
No. Her family has very, very rigid ideas about everything from gender roles to social class, and Barbara is an outlier. She has embraced the world of punk music very, very early. It's 1975, so just the very beginnings of the punk movement are occurring. And she dresses in a way that looks very strange, especially to her mother, who has really specific ideas about femininity and the way that her daughter should look and act. And unfortunately, she's seen as sort of a replacement for the child who went missing, who was a golden child in the Van Laar's family. He was 8 years old. He was outdoorsy. He was a beautiful child. He was everything the Van Laars could have wished for. And when he disappeared, they had another child in their grief, but she has gone in the complete opposite direction. So she's really struggling within her family.
Tell us about one of the officers assigned to the case, Officer Judy Luptak.
Yeah, I did a little bit of research in the writing of this novel about the first crop of female investigators in New York State was also the first crop of female investigators in the nation. And so Judy is a fictional character, but she's based on the women who were among the first to be promoted to the rank of investigators in the State Police of New York. And her brother teasingly calls her the nation's first. She, like many of the women in this book, is up against certain expectations about the way she should look and act, but also by virtue of the fact that she's a woman, she's able to access certain information that some of her male colleagues are not able to access. And certain characters in the book trust her in a way that they don't trust the men.
Help us understand the divisions between the Camp families and the townies.
Yeah, I became really, really interested in the history of the creation of the Adirondack Park Preserve, which happened in the late 1800s. For many years, the Adirondacks were kind of ravaged by the logging industry and were fairly unprotected from an environmental standpoint. Only when very wealthy families like the Roosevelts, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers began to discover the beauty of the Adirondacks and began to make summer homes in the Adirondacks did the government of New York State suddenly become interested in environmental conservation, which, of course, was a morally complex issue because it put pressure on the many working class people who had made their living off the land. Mm-hmm. And so the book aims to tell a really good story, but underneath it is this theme of class tension. And so the Van Laars represent this wealthy family who've made a home of the land and who embrace the environment and who embrace conservation, but only insofar as it serves them. Whereas some of the more working class characters have suddenly found themselves out of work after generations of making a living from the land. All of that is kind of at play in the background of the novel.
Mm. You very skillfully settled suspicions on a number of characters within the course of a story. And I found myself thinking, especially in this time of the popularity of true crime stories, people can convince themselves of many possibilities, can't we?
Yeah, it's a fun exercise for me to never outline a novel. That's my practice because it lets me discover things at the same time that the reader does. Of course, I go back and draft and redraft, but I love hearing from readers that certain twists were a complete surprise to them, but that they felt earned or that they didn't feel implausible. That's my great ambition whenever I write a mystery, is to keep people guessing and to have them feel the sensation of surprise, but also to feel satisfied that, oh, this could really happen. And the best way that I know to do that is by not knowing the answers myself as I enter the writing of a book.
Liz Moore's new novel, The God of the Woods, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Scott. It's been a joy to talk to you.
That's it for this week on NPR's Book of the Day. If you want more, you can sign up for our newsletter at npr.org/newsletter/books. I'm Andrew Limbong. The podcast is produced by Isabella Gomez-Sarmiento and edited by Megan Sullivan. Our founding editor is Petra Mayer. The show elements for this week were produced and edited by Tinby Ermias, Janaki Mehta, Ashley Locke, Thomas Danielian, Michael Scotto, Miranda Kennedy, Danny Hajek, Elena Burnett, Courtney Dorning, Samantha Balaban, and Ed McNulty. Beth Donovan is our managing editor. Thanks for listening.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Rosetta Stone, an expert in language learning for 30 years. Right now, NPR listeners can get Rosetta Stone's lifetime membership to 25 different languages for 50% off. Learn more at rosettastone.com/NPR.
This message comes from NPR sponsor Mint Mobile. From the gas pump to the grocery store, inflation is everywhere. So Mint Mobile is offering premium wireless starting at just $15 a month. To get your new phone plan for just $15, go to mintmobile.com/switch.